Something strange is happening right now. You hear my voice, but there's another voice at the same time. That voice silently uttering the words as you read these lines, setting the tone, sensing the meaning. The voice inside your head, that's exactly where we are, because no one knows exactly where that voice comes from. It's not somewhere. It's invisible. It doesn't show up on an X-ray. It can't be marked on a scanner. Yet it's at the center of every experience. What you call I is there. Humanity has achieved extraordinary success in deciphering the external world. We've mapped mountains, measured the ocean floor, sent robots to Mars, split atoms, and developed theories about the origin of the universe. But despite all this progress, there's still an invisible boundary we haven't crossed: consciousness. Or rather, the conscious mind. That sadness that arises within you when music plays. That feeling that catches in your throat when you remember a childhood memory. That feeling of, I am here. None of these appear on a screen. Scientists call this subjective experience. Like Thomas Nagel's famous question, what is it like to be a bat? Because it's not just about behavior, but how that behavior feels internally. To live, to know you're alive. No one knows for sure where this feeling comes from. Is it just the firing of neurons? Or is there a much deeper, much more fundamental reality at play? René Descartes once said, "I think, therefore I am." But what if there's a mistake here? What if we aren't the ones thinking? What if we are merely a field, a point of observation, through which thoughts pass? Modern neuroscience tells us how the brain works, but it can't explain why consciousness exists. The brain is a process, so why does experience arise? If consciousness isn't just a biological byproduct, then we might need to look a little further down the microscope, at the quantum level. Because throughout history, people have always sought consciousness somewhere beyond the body. Primitive societies believed the soul resided in breath. In ancient Egypt, the heart was the center of consciousness. For centuries, opening a skull was considered a violation of the sacred, as it was believed to house the gods, the soul, or a divine essence. When Socrates said, "Know thyself," he was referring not to the external world, but to inner consciousness. Buddha went even further, stating that the self is not a fixed entity, but a constantly changing flow of perception. In other words, thousands of years ago, people were asking a question we still haven't been able to answer today. Who is conscious? Let's fast forward. We've built microscopes, examined the brain layer by layer. With fMRI machines, we've seen which region is active in which thought. We've recorded electrical patterns with EEG, synapses, neurotransmitters, chemical balances, all before our eyes. But still, something was missing. We could see where a memory was stored in the brain, but we couldn't explain why that memory was your memory. Why do your eyes fill with tears when a song plays? Is it just sound waves? Why does your heart warm when you remember your mother's voice? We've written algorithms, created learning machines, developed talking artificial intelligence. But when we ask them, do you know it exists? There's no answer. Because there's computation, but no experience. It is precisely at this point that some scientists have begun to ask a radical question. Figures like Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff have suggested that consciousness may arise not only from the classical interactions of neurons, but from quantum processes occurring in the microtubules within the brain. A controversial but striking idea. Consciousness may be a process organized at the quantum level. Because the quantum world is very different from the reality we are accustomed to. There, particles do not have definite positions, only probabilities. They don't decide until they are observed. An electron can be in two places at once. Schrödinger's cat is both alive and dead until someone looks at it. And that act of looking, that is observation, determines the outcome. But what if consciousness is connected to this fundamental property of the universe? What if the self-frequency is a special resonance the brain establishes with a quantum field? In physics, resonance means a system interacts maximally at a specific frequency. Perhaps consciousness is a frequency that harmonizes with a universal field. That's why experience arises even though everything is made of matter. As we get closer to atoms, the solidity of matter disappears. Everything is emptiness and probability. What we call reality is largely a perception. And if the most fundamental layer of the universe is not unconscious, perhaps consciousness is not something added to the universe later, but has been there from the beginning. This perspective sees consciousness not just as a product of the brain, but as a field that the brain accesses, like radio waves. Radio doesn't produce music, it picks up the frequency. Perhaps the brain is a receiver that tunes to the frequency of consciousness. And what we call self is an experience that arises at that frequency. If this is true, the self is not just a biological phenomenon, but a cosmic one. What we call divine creation isn't an externally imposed force. It may be the universe's own way of experiencing itself. And you, right now, as you read these lines, are one of those moments when the universe is observing itself. Silently, without you noticing, but completely real. Chapter 2. The Observer Effect. The moment of decision in reality. Physicists call this superposition. That is, what something is exactly is not clear until it is observed. It is neither here nor there. It is neither this nor that. It is simply a state of intertwined probabilities. Reality exists in uncertainty before certainty. And this uncertainty is the fundamental state of the universe, until an observation occurs. At that very moment, something almost magical happens. The wave function collapses. Infinite possibilities are reduced to a single outcome. Blur suddenly turns into clarity. The universe seems to have made a decision. But the real question is, who is making this decision? The particle, the measuring device, or the observer themselves? Quantum experiments have shown us that we not only measure something, but we also change it. Observation is not a passive act. Observation is intervention. It affects what we are measuring. Therefore, some physicists have raised this unsettling possibility. Perhaps reality is incomplete before it is observed. Perhaps the universe doesn't know it is being observed. It only takes on a specific form when observed. This idea has divided scientists for decades. Why does the wave function collapse? Is it the eye, the interaction of the measuring device with the particle, or conscious awareness? Niels Bohr argued that measurement alone was sufficient. But Einstein never accepted this ambiguity. According to him, the universe was there even if we weren't looking. However, quantum experiments were clear enough to disturb Einstein. The conscious mind has always remained on the sidelines in this debate. It wasn't explicitly included, but it couldn't be entirely excluded either. Because if consciousness plays no role, then what exactly is measurement? isn't measuring something essentially knowing it? And can knowing be possible without awareness? At this point, the mind ceases to be merely a mechanism reacting to reality. If observation determines the outcome, the mind doesn't just perceive the world, it becomes part of how the world shapes itself. This isn't science fiction. This is one of the most fundamental consequences of quantum mechanics as we use it today. It may not seem logical, but it works. Your phone works. Your GPS works. Your computer works. It all depends on these strange rules. Now imagine this: a single particle, a cloud of possibilities spinning, vibrating, shimmering. It could go left, it could go right, up, down. Every possibility exists simultaneously until you look at it. But the moment the observation occurs, the particle chooses a path. And that choice happens neither a second before nor a second after. It happens precisely at the moment of observation. This is the most unsettling truth of physics, the observer effect. You're not just observing the universe. You're a part of how the universe formed. Reality seems to be waiting for you to press the play button. Therefore, an old philosophical question is reborn in quantum physics. Does a tree falling in the forest make a sound when no one is around? The quantum version is even more difficult. If no one measured it, did the particle really exist in a particular state? According to quantum mechanics, the answer is not clear. In fact, sometimes the answer might be no. This idea shook the foundations of science. The great physicist John Wheeler described this situation as the participatory universe. According to him, the universe is not a passive stage. The observer is part of the game. Wheeler went a step further, saying, "The universe does not fully exist until it is observed." Of course, many physicists disagreed. "No," they said, "it's not the mind that does this. It's the interaction, the devices, the mathematics." But others quietly continued to ask, if it's not the moment something is known, then what is measurement? And is it possible to know without consciousness? If awareness influences the outcome of a quantum event, then consciousness is not a byproduct. It is the process itself. Perhaps a key, perhaps a mirror, perhaps the universe's way of looking at itself. And then we come to something even stranger: quantum entanglement. Two entangled particles, even if scattered across opposite ends of the universe, still behave as a single system. When one is measured, the other reacts instantly. Distance is irrelevant. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance because it was unacceptable to classical physics. However, experiments have repeatedly confirmed this. At this point, the question becomes inevitable. If matter can circulate, why can't consciousness? What if our thoughts, feelings, and awareness aren't trapped inside our skulls? What if we are unconsciously interconnected systems, vibrating within the same field? The moment you think of someone, that person finds you. You feel the pain of someone far away. These are dismissed as coincidences by science. But quantum theory whispers another possibility. Perhaps we are not as separate as we think. Perhaps consciousness is not local, not confined to the brain, but something that extends across the field. Some scientists are now beginning to think of the human mind not as fixed data repositories, but as waveforms vibrating together in a sea of possibilities. If this is true, every thought creates an effect. Every awareness gently ripples the field. Perhaps you're not just a small part of the universe. Perhaps the universe experiences itself through you. Separation may be an illusion. Loneliness may be a perceptual error. And this low vibrational hum may be something ancient, vibrating just below perception. And from here, there's no turning back. Because when you become aware of this vibration, you move towards that bold question, which pushes the boundaries of both science and the self. If consciousness plays a role in the formation of reality, then we are not merely spectators. We are part of creation. Chapter 3: Traces of Ancient Consciousness. Pre-scientific maps of reality. First, we must ask ourselves, did we truly discover the universe, or are we merely recalling a very ancient memory? Long before atoms had names, long before mathematics was reduced to symbols, long before scientists donned white coats and wrote equations, could the human mind have interacted with the universe in a different way? In an age without sterile laboratories, the quest was rawer, more naked, more direct. In stone-carved temples, wind-swept caves, and open spaces where earth and sky could be felt simultaneously, people were not trying to measure the universe, but to solve it. These people were not observers. They were participants. They were not looking at the universe from the outside. They were immersing themselves in it. On star-filled nights, these seekers, spread across flat plains, did not use telescopes. For them, the universe was not an object. The universe was an experience to be entered into. Over time, we began to call them mystics, sages, shamans. But perhaps they were the first mapmakers of inner space, the first explorers of consciousness. In ancient India, the Upanishads whispered a silent but powerful sentence: Atman is Brahman. That is, individual consciousness is not separate from universal consciousness. The soul is not an isolated spark. It is the whole itself. This was not a metaphor. This was a claim born from direct experience. A meditating yogi, in moments when the boundaries of the self dissolve, could no longer discern where what he called I ended and where the universe began. At the same time, in China, Taoist thought was taking shape. Laozi described the universe not as a mechanism to be controlled, but as an incomprehensible flow. Tao is a principle that flows beneath the visible, unnameable, but carrying everything. In modern physics, we call this field. But in the language of that time, it meant an order that no net could capture. In the Andes Mountains and the dense rainforests of the Amazon, shamans conversed with plants, felt the cycles of the stars in their bodies, and altered states of consciousness through rituals. Their aim wasn't to gather information, but to break down boundaries. Healing was not just for the body, but for all of existence. Humans were not separate from nature. Nature was humanity expanded. These weren't fairy tales. These were maps of a living, interconnected, and conscious reality of the universe. Every leaf was a signal. Every stone a recorder. Separation hadn't yet been invented. Mystics didn't need microscopes because they were already looking from within. Now pause. Take a breath. Does this sound familiar? Because modern science, centuries later, is beginning to reach a similar point, albeit in a very different language. When quantum physics entered the scene, particles began to disregard distance. Non-local connections were discovered. Fields shifted through observation. Reality ceased to be static. What mystics called unity, physicists call non-locality. The same reality, two different languages. On one side, there's a yogi sitting quietly, thousands of years ago, eyes closed, searching for the point where the self dissolves. On the other, There's a physicist in a laboratory, passing photons through a double slit. He too is exploring the same question. What is reality before it is observed? They never spoke. They didn't live in the same era. They didn't use the same words, but they looked into the same abyss. Today, some scientists are beginning to ask aloud, what if consciousness isn't a byproduct of quantum reality? What if our minds are already resonating with the deepest structure of the universe? Roger Penrose argues that consciousness is not computable. Stuart Hameroff suggests that quantum processes may play a role in microtubules. David Bohm says the universe has a deeper layer called the hidden order. These ideas were unsettling to the mainstream, but they opened a door. And then a wave of panic swept through. A radical but simple claim: consciousness is not something that came to the universe later. It has been here since the beginning. Every atom, every particle, however faint, carries a spark of experience, just like mass, charge, or spin. This doesn't mean stones think, but it also questions the idea that the universe is completely blind and insensitive. Because the real hard question is, how did consciousness arise from a completely unconscious universe? Galileo extracted the soul from the universe to save science. He reduced matter to mere form, motion, and measurable quantities. It worked. He advanced science. But now, 400 years later, confronted with quantum physics, scientists may realize, perhaps we should take back what we extracted from the universe. Because particles change their behavior when observed, fields behave as if they carry information. Reality seems to be waiting to be noticed. And at this point, the question arises again. Is the universe alive? Is consciousness everywhere? Or are we the universe's way of knowing itself? This question opens the next door. And behind that door, not only science is questioned, but also the self. Chapter 4. The memory of the universe. The space of consciousness and beyond time. Now we shift the perspective slightly, because from this point on, the question is no longer, did consciousness originate from the universe? But how the universe itself is interwoven with consciousness. And this question is so profound that it pushes the boundaries of the scientific language we are accustomed to. The traditional view confines consciousness within the brain. Neurons fire, chemicals flow, electrical signals are generated, and the curtain closes. However, some scientists have noticed a disturbing inconsistency at precisely this point, because the brain may only be a receiver, like a radio, a device that captures the broadcast, not produces it. Nobel laureate neurophysiologist Sir John Eccles was one of the first to explicitly state that the brain may be necessary but not sufficient for consciousness. According to him, neurons provide access to consciousness rather than producing it. This idea was considered marginal for a long time, until quantum physics and information theory entered the scene. Physicist David Bohm described the universe not as a machine broken down into parts, but as a holistic structure he called an implicit order. According to this model, reality consisted of a deep flow beneath the visible surface, where everything was interconnected. Consciousness, then, could be considered not an external byproduct of this flow, but rather the flow's way of self-awareness. Some of Bohm's students took this idea even further. If information was the fundamental fabric of the universe, then consciousness was the experienced form of that information. Here, the concept of time begins to crack. Because time may not be a straight line flowing forward as we imagine. Physicist Julian Barber argued that time is actually an illusion. According to him, there were moments in the universe, but no flow. Each moment was a complete universe in itself. What we call memory was merely the relationship between these moments. If this is true, consciousness may not be an event that is born and disappears in an instant. It may be a process experienced from different points within a timeless realm. This idea became even more groundbreaking with quantum entanglement experiments. Two particles could react simultaneously, even if they were light years apart. There was no time between them, no distance. Information was not bound by space. Physicist Anton Zeilinger said of these experiments, "Reality is not local. The universe is far more deeply interconnected than we imagine. If information is not local, why should consciousness be local? If the effect is not dependent on distance, why should experience be confined only to the skull?" Some theorists open a radical door here. Consciousness may be a universal field. The brain, then, is a lens that filters, focuses, and individualizes this field. From this perspective, death can be thought of not as an annihilation, but as the interruption of a signal. The broadcast continues. The receiver shuts off. At this point, science unknowingly approaches ancient questions. The distance between what ancient philosophers called the soul and what modern physics calls the information field may be shorter than imagined. Because information does not disappear, it only changes form. Even the second law of thermodynamics states that information is not completely erased, only dispersed. And now the question quietly returns: if consciousness is a property of the fundamental fabric of the universe, if time is not absolute, if knowledge is permanent, then what is man? Perhaps man is the universe's attempt to experience itself from a limited perspective. Perhaps you are a mirror that the universe holds up to itself. And perhaps what we call awareness is the momentary clearing of the fog from this mirror. In the next chapter, we will delve into the effects of this perspective on human identity, the fear of death, and the search for meaning. Because if consciousness is greater than we imagine, then living may carry a much deeper meaning than we think. Chapter 5: Traces of Consciousness, Death, Memory, and Returning Information. Now we delve even deeper, because at this point the question is no longer a simple curiosity like, what happens after death? It becomes a question of where consciousness is truly stored and how information behaves in the universe. Classical science viewed memory as a temporary record written into the biological tissue of the brain. Synapses weaken, cells die, and the story is erased. But this clarity disappeared when quantum physics entered the scene. Because in the quantum world, information does not disappear in the ordinary sense. It transforms, disperses, takes on other forms, but it does not vanish. When physicist Rolf Landauer said, "Information is physical," it wasn't just a technical statement. It was a radical claim about how the universe works. If information were a physical entity, to completely destroy it would be against the laws of the universe. This is where the question of consciousness flares up again. Because consciousness is the knowledge of experience. It is the coded form of lived experience. Your laughter, your fears, your regrets, your inner narrative that makes you who you are. All of these are forms of knowledge. This was precisely the point Penrose emphasized. He argued that the intuitive, instant grasp of mathematical truths in the human mind could not be explained solely by an algorithmic process. Computers operate according to rules, but the human mind sometimes transcends these rules. Therefore, Penrose believed that consciousness must have an origin beyond classical computation. His focus on microtubules, along with Hameroff, was no coincidence. Microtubules may be one of the rare biological structures in which quantum superposition can be maintained, even if only for a short time. If this is true, consciousness is a process arising from the collapse of instantaneous quantum states, but also in constant contact with the universal quantum field. And here, the word process is crucial, because processes, unlike objects, do not end. They change shape. When the concept of death is viewed from this perspective, the picture changes dramatically. Death can be the disruption of a stable state. In other words, consciousness exits a narrow, body-specific channel and spreads into a wider field of information. Just as a laser beam disperses when the lens focusing it breaks, the light doesn't disappear. It simply no longer converges at a single point. Quantum entanglement makes this analogy even more unsettling. Particles that once interacted, even if scattered across opposite ends of the universe, still behave as a single system. Information remains a hidden link between them. If consciousness is an entangled process with the universe, death doesn't break that entanglement. It only ends its local expression. At this point, some researchers have stopped dismissing narratives of tunnels, light, or timeless awareness experienced after death as mere biological hallucinations. Because the cross-cultural similarity of these experiences and the complete disappearance of time perception may point to something more than a simple brain crash. Neuroscientist Sam Parnia finds reported conscious experiences during clinical death particularly problematic, given the absence of measurable brain activity. Let's revisit the idea of a holographic universe. If the reality we inhabit is a reflection of a more fundamental surface of information, then the body could be an avatar defined within that reflection. Death isn't the end of the game. It's the closing of the interface. The player doesn't disappear. This idea eerily overlaps with ancient mystical teachings. The Bardo state described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead is defined as the state of consciousness between death and rebirth. Neither here nor there. In modern terms, a temporary loss of resolution. The information is still there, but not yet crystallized in a new structure. At this point, the idea of reincarnation ceases to be merely a religious narrative. It transforms into the idea of the rearrangement of information. If quantum information is preserved on a universal scale, then theoretically, it's not impossible for it to interact again with another biological system later on. Just like the same melody being played on a different instrument. And here, a disturbing question arises. What if the déjà vu moments we remember, the dreams, or the feeling of, I know this place, aren't just an illusion of the brain? What if consciousness merely masks the traces of past experiences instead of erasing them completely? This isn't a story that offers definitive answers. Science is honest here. We don't know. But we can no longer say, there is nothing. Because quantum physics, information theory, and consciousness research repeat the same whisper. Reality may be deeper than we think. Death more permeable than we imagine. Perhaps the real question is, If this life is a narrative, who is writing it? And when the curtain closes, does the story end? Or does only the narrator change? In the next chapter, we will look at how this question overturns the concepts of human freedom, fate, and choice. Because if consciousness is universal, every choice we make may have a far greater impact than we imagine. Chapter 6: Branched Souls, Multiple Lives, and the Web of Consciousness. Perhaps the structure doesn't dissolve into a shadow scattered in the darkness when the body collapses. Perhaps it persists as a suspended possibility in the deep architecture of the universe, a pattern ready to re-emerge when the right conditions are realigned. Just as a melody doesn't disappear when it falls silent, but merely hides in silence and vibrates again when it finds a new string, a new resonance. Similarly, instead of vanishing with the disintegration of the body, consciousness may remain as an order within the universal fabric, waiting to be played again. And it is precisely at this point that the mind-challenging possibility emerges. Not one, but many worlds. Hugh Everett's interpretation of the multiverse is perhaps one of the most unsettling yet consistent explanations of quantum mechanics. The wave function doesn't collapse, it splits. Every choice, every decision, every what-if moment, instead of locking reality into a single line, branches it out. One self chooses one path, another. Countless yous, countless lives continue on your path. But what if reincarnation isn't a linear journey of a single soul? What if it's not a conscious self leaping back and forth in time, but a form of awareness shifting between parallel fabrics? What if this is the reason for some wounds, inexplicable fears, causeless joys, wounds that leave no mark on the body but resonate in the mind? What if this is the source of that familiar déjà vu feeling, struck once and still vibrating, spreading through your spinal cord? Reconsider quantum entanglement. Two particles that once interacted continue to behave as a single system, even if they are scattered to opposite ends of the universe. The bond between them doesn't weaken with distance. It doesn't dissolve with time. If consciousness is so intertwined, perhaps your awareness is not bound to a single body, but to a larger fabric of consciousness stretching across time. Each life is a note, but part of a chorus that never falls silent. Ancient traditions have called this realm by different names. Some have called it the Akashic Records, the vibrational trace of everything that has been, is, and could be. Modern science doesn't yet use this language, but the concept is slowly taking shape. Perhaps one day we will call it quantum recurring consciousness. Not a fixed self, but a wave constantly taking on new forms, echoing in different faces. And here, not just philosophical examples, but strikingly concrete ones come into play. A child who has just learned to speak describes the streets of a village he has never been to. He pronounces words in a language he has never heard before with the correct accent. He recounts memories that are not his own, but carry a heavy emotional burden. These are not fairy tales. Dr. Ian Stevenson and later Jim Tucker documented thousands of cases. Something was still unresolved, a memory that arose before the brain developed, inexplicable by the body. Where was this memory stored? If consciousness is merely the product of neurons, where did this information come from? Thus, the question becomes clearer, but less reassuring. What if consciousness isn't a line? What if it's a wheel, a spiral, a rotation? What if every life isn't the song itself, but just a line, and the last breath isn't where that song ends. You turn the page, you raise the pen, and something else begins to be written. Perhaps you've lived it before. Perhaps you will live it again. Perhaps, in a hidden twist and turn of the universe, you are living all your lives right now. Every heartbeat resonates more widely than you imagine. Have you ever looked at someone and couldn't believe you were seeing them for the first time? You catch a fleeting glimpse of a face in a crowded room. The smile is reciprocated and a voice whispers from within, "I know you." Or the ground on a street you're walking down for the first time vibrates as if saying, "Welcome home." We call these coincidences because we don't know another word. But in the quantum world, coincidence is often the name of a connection we don't know. This isn't a metaphor. Entanglement is real. It's been measured. It's been verified time and time again. No message, no signal, just an unbreakable bond. Einstein shuddered at this. But perhaps it's the universe's oldest habit. But what if souls are also entangled? What if we don't wander alone? What if consciousness reincarnates not as individual beings, but as clustered networks? In ancient times, this was called soul families. A modern physicist might call it a quantum consciousness network. Beings existing at the same frequency, at different times, in different bodies, but repeatedly encountering similar themes. Bodies dissolve, reunite, deepen. If consciousness isn't locked away in the skull, isn't local, isn't a space extending beyond the skin, then what you call I is perhaps the surface stirring of something larger. Carl Jung called this the collective unconscious. Physicists speak of the zero-point field, a space buzzing beneath every atom, perceived as emptiness but filled with information. Perhaps when we die, we don't cease to exist. We return to that space. And when we return, we bring with us not only ourselves, but also the traces of each other. That's why some stories never end. Some bonds never break. Some losses are not just a void, but a familiar silence. The path is not a single thread. It is a weave. And fate, not a straight line. A living web woven with memories, choices, and repetitions. A long dance of souls to learn, heal, and remember. This is why losing someone is so painful. Not just because they're gone, but also because of the void they leave in that network. In the next section, we'll examine the impact of this network on free will, choice, and the illusion of fate. Because if the paths branch out, the real question is, which one do you really choose?